This Latin proverb was first used in 13th century by Roman commentator Accursius and was introduced into English law by William Blackstone in his commentaries on the laws of England. Under this principle, the owner of the land was the owner of the whole airspace above it, and without any limits. Obviously, such understanding is not valid anymore, but it is still worth mentioning because it was largely accepted until the birth of civil aviation. In this class, we are going to continue our discussion on the topic of territory. We'll go beyond land territory and talk about what's above and what's beyond. In other words, the air, the outer space, and the seas. So let's start our discussion with what's immediately above, the airspace and the outer space. What is the difference between airspace and outer space? Is there a line which separates airspace from outer space? Well, the answer is no. It is not defined anywhere where airspace ends and where outer space begins, because international community could not agree on a fixed boundary between these two zones. But then why not? Why couldn't international community agree on the demarcation line between airspace and outer space? And then what is the difference between airspace and outer space? Just keep these questions in mind and we'll come back to this question towards the end of this class. For now, focus on airspace, which is separate from outer space. Now the question that you should ask me as a good student is, Sir, why is the regulation of airspace important? Why should we make laws? Why can't we just leave it unregulated? Why can't we just allow it to be explored freely? Well, the obvious answer is no. And for a good articulation for the reasons why airspace needs to be regulated, let's turn to the Convention on International Civil Aviation of 1944 and read its preamble. The preamble reads, whereas the future development of international civil aviation can greatly help to create and preserve friendship and understanding among the nations and people of the world, yet its abuse can become a threat to the general security, and whereas it is desirable to avoid friction and promote that cooperation between nations and people upon which the peace of the world depends. So remember, they are talking about the abuse of airspace. They are talking about threat to general security of the world. They are also talking about the fact that the peace of the world depends on the proper regulation of airspace, and this comes during the time of World War II. So that should help you make more sense of this document. So in sum, the regulation of airspace is important because of the fact that the general peace and security of the world depends on it, and also the fact that no one should be allowed to monopolize airspace. No one should be allowed to monopolize and exploit airspace to their benefit, because it would undermine the concept of sovereignty. So let's talk about the law relating to airspace in this class. This branch of law which deals with airspace is also called air law, or the International Law of Airspace. To understand the origins of air law, let's look at Paul Fauchet. He was a French lawyer and a scholar, and he's considered as a pioneer of air law. Fauchet's concept consists of an idea that air is free and states should have only rights to such an extent as is necessary for conservation in times of peace and war. The highest artificial building in Paris at his time was Eiffel Tower, which rose to 300 meters above ground level. This altitude was suggested as a vertical lower limitation. The state's right of self-preservation should range to an altitude of 1500 meters at that time, at which it was technically impossible to take accurate photographs. Later, Fauchet lowered his limit to 500 meters. In addition, the airspace above high seas and over large parts of international waters were also supposed to be free. It is important to keep in mind that Fauchet's first concept is based on an idea that balloons would be commonly used as aircraft. More advanced vehicles like the airplanes, which were invented by the Wright brothers, were not even included in his line of thought because they were not invented at that time. In his view, sovereignty over airspace had to be understood as real and consistent occupation. Means you cannot have a real and consistent occupation over airspace. So you cannot say that you can exercise sovereignty over airspace, because that is something that we have learned. To have an effective occupation is an important aspect of a territory. But he says, since you cannot have a consistent occupation over airspace, airspace is supposed to be free. So his concept of freedom of air is unique because he is one of the first ones to have started this whole discussion and international debate on the issue of freedom or sovereignty over airspace. That's why he is prominent. That's why his ideas are prominent. Ideas are important. Now, a large number of states, including the British, Dutch, Swiss, Austrian, they were in favor of sovereignty of each state over their airspace. They argued that there's no need to show complete dominance and consistent occupation over airspace to establish sovereignty. They were eventually in favor of sovereignty of states on their airspace. So one side we have the French concept of freedom of airspace, and on the other side we have the British and Dutch and Swiss concept of sovereignty over airspace. And these are juxtaposed against each other, and this face-off came directly in the 1910 International Air Navigation Conference in Paris. And because of this clash, the negotiations of that conference were unsuccessful. Now later on, because of technical progress made in aviation, more options opened in the discussion about airspace. The proposition that states should have complete sovereignty over their airspace got general approval after World War I, because all the states that were involved, they understood the importance of the territorial air, because aircrafts were used for the first time in any war fought between any nations in World War I. So they were in favor of asserting full sovereignty over their national airspace. Neutral nations in turn, they also denied the right of passage to states which were at war, and they also aligned their national airspace with the rules applying to land surface rather than those applicable to neutral territorial waters. In fact, both Swiss and Dutch forces maintained the integrity of neutral airspaces, brought down a number of belligerent aircraft that had penetrated their national airspaces. By the end of World War I, national sovereignty over airspace has gained universal acceptance. In the 1919 Paris Convention for the Regulation of Aerial Navigation, it embodied an idea of full sovereignty over airspace in its Article 1. Let's look at the Article 1 of the 1919 Paris Convention. Article 1 says, the high contracting parties recognize that every power has complete and exclusive sovereignty over airspace above its territory. For the purpose of present convention, the territory of a state shall be understood as including national territory, both that of mother country and of its colonies, and the territorial waters adjacent thereto. What are territorial waters? There is a line which is drawn up to which the water is considered to be a part of the territory, that we'll learn when we go to the law of seas. But as of now, territory includes territorial waters. So you see how the conception has changed. Very beginning, when the idea was first floated that airspace should be free, in the context that the highest flying objects we had at that time were balloons. But later on, because of technological developments, the world changed and the law had to adapt, and the legal regime responded by making airspace subject to exclusive sovereignty of states, right? So that's basically the origins of the regulation of air law. Now let's look at the present regime. What are the laws which are governing airspace in today's times? And we will not look at that in all the detail because we are not supposed to do it according to our syllabus. I just have to give you an introduction of air and space law. But I'll still take a bit more time because I think it is important and it gives you a scope to investigate, to research, to find out more about it. The present regime concerning air navigation developed from the 1944 Chicago Conference and the conventions adopted there. In the main, the Chicago Conference reaffirmed the principles agreed in the 1919 Convention with regard to the sovereignty of states over their airspace. On November 1, 1944, the American President Franklin Roosevelt invited all the Allied powers, together with some neutral governments, to a conference in Chicago regarding civil aviation. The purpose of conference was to come together for the future and make use of airspace as efficiently as possible.
At the Stevens Hotel in Chicago, the first international conference on post-war aviation opened. Many and varied are the questions to be discussed by the arriving delegates of 51 different countries. Chief among these questions is the future freedom of the world air transportation routes. On a globe of the world, delegates discuss proposed international airlines and terminals, preliminary guidance in making the significant post-war transfer of many important military routes back to civilian operation. United States Assistant Secretary of State Burl delivers a message from President Roosevelt.
On behalf of the United States, I offer a hearty welcome to the delegations of the 51 nations represented at this International Conference on Civil Aviation. You are called to undertake a task of highest importance. I am very sure you will succeed. I hope you will not dally with the thought of creating great blocks of closed air, thereby tracing in the sky the conditions of future wars. I know you will see to it that the air which God gave to everyone shall not become the means of domination over anyone.
The Chicago Conference also led to the creation of International Civil Aviation Organization, which is a UN specialized agency based in Canada which concentrates on providing technical and administrative cooperation between states in the field of civil aviation, ranging from adoption of agreed safety standards to the encouragement of expansion of navigational facilities. ICAO's main aims and objectives are to develop principles and techniques of air navigation and to foster planning and development of international air transport. Let us take a closer look at the International Civil Aviation Convention of 1944. We've already seen its preamble to understand why regulation of airspace is important. Now let's go to Article 1, which speaks about sovereignty. It reads, "The contracting states recognize that every state has complete and exclusive sovereignty over the airspace above its territory." That means it reaffirms the principle of sovereignty as it was established in the 1919 Convention as well. Let's go to Article 2. Article 2 says, "For the purpose of this convention, the territory of a state shall be deemed to be land areas and territorial waters adjacent thereto under sovereignty, suzerainty, protection, or mandate of such state." So it says that the territory includes land areas and it includes territorial waters. What are territorial waters? As I told, there is a line drawn from the land boundary of a state of a certain miles. To that extent, the waters also form the part of the territory. The concept of territory as specified in Article 2 applies to non-parties to this convention as well. So you can say that it has acquired a status of customary international law. One more thing that you should know is that the contracting states also agree to the principle that there cannot be any exercise of sovereignty over terra nullius, and no one can exercise sovereignty over the airspace over the high seas as well. Now, after knowing how Article 2 defines territory for the purpose of this convention, we need to see what are the boundaries of airspace and what are the vertical boundaries and what are the horizontal boundaries. So imagine a 3D space over a land where there is a horizontal axis and there's a vertical axis. We need to understand both horizontally and vertically how far does the airspace extend to. The airspace is normally perceived as a three-dimensional space above the state's territory and also within the jurisdiction of space. So that space lying within the three-dimensional space is within the jurisdiction of the state. The meaning of the term airspace denotes the space where air can be found, as opposed to a space where air cannot be found, which is just space, right? Or the outer space. The English text of this treaty uses the word airspace, whereas interestingly, French and Italian texts use the word atmospheric space. So you get the meaning. The part till where you find air in the atmosphere, you can consider it as airspace. So vertically speaking, the territorial scope of sovereignty lies upwards all the way up to space, right? Now, this is a problem. Vertical delimitation of airspace is not yet settled. How far up can you go and still call it airspace? And when does airspace really become outer space? No treaty regarding outer space defines that. And it is also clear that no state has any claim to outer space. So outer space cannot be claim of sovereignty of any other state, which is also called as res communis. It is a common heritage of mankind. So the thing for you to know is there's no vertical delimitation, means going upwards and upwards and upwards. There's no line which separates airspace from outer space because there has been no agreement so far. And the fact that airspace and outer space are different is clear because the legal effect is airspace is coming within the exclusive sovereignty of the state, whereas outer space is a res communis, common heritage of mankind. So that's what separates airspace from outer space. As of now, we can say that the upper limit of a state's right in airspace is above the height at which an aircraft can fly. Now let's talk about horizontal boundaries. Air law has a strong relationship with maritime law and the law of sea, and you're going to study law of sea later. The boundaries of the sovereignty in air coincides with the boundaries of sovereignty in the sea. So one thing is obvious, that land area belongs to state sovereignty, but what is the situation with surrounding waters if it's a coastal state? So the Convention on the Law of Sea says the sovereignty of a coastal state extends beyond its land territory and internal waters to an adjacent belt of sea, which is described as territorial sea. This sovereignty extends to the airspace above territorial sea as well as to its bed and subsoil. So as you can see in the picture, what it says is that exclusive sovereignty of a state extends to territorial waters, territorial sea, which is adjacent to the land, and the sovereignty of airspace above territorial sea is also exclusive to the state. So you can see there is a line drawn which is labeled as to the left side, which is labeled as national airspace. It is coinciding with the boundary of the territorial sea. Article 3 of the Convention on the Law of Sea says that the width of territorial sea is not supposed to be more than 12 nautical miles, and 1 nautical mile is equal to 1852 meters. Now remember that this exclusive sovereignty over airspace is for territorial waters only. Further out over the high seas, the right to fly is open to all. Now we'll study more about what are the different zones that you can see in the image. So don't worry much about them. We'll study that in the chapter on the law of seas. As of now, just focus on few things. territorial waters, national airspace, and international airspace. Remember that the exclusive sovereignty of states over their airspace exists to their land plus territorial sea, that is national airspace, and any space over international waters is international airspace. Article 3 is important. It speaks about applicability. Article 3 says this convention shall be applicable only to civil aircraft and shall not be applicable to state aircraft. So it's applicable to civil aircraft but not applicable to state aircraft. Now what do they mean? What is the meaning of civil aircraft and what is the meaning of state aircraft? Now aircraft, they have explained it later here. Aircraft used in military, customs and police services shall be deemed to be state aircraft. No state aircraft of a contracting state shall fly over the territory of another state or thereon without authorization by special agreement or otherwise in consonance with terms thereof. So it says state aircraft of a contracting state of this treaty cannot fly over the territory of another state without prior authorization. Now let's look at Article 5, which is one of the most important provisions of this convention. It says right of non-scheduled flight. Now what is the meaning of non-scheduled flight? We need to understand the meaning of this, because to understand this provision we need to know what is the meaning of non-scheduled flight, and this is not defined in this convention. So where do we find it? Let's look at this document that I found on the ICAO website. And remember what ICAO is? I hope you do. So this is a review of classification and definitions used for civil aviation activities, and basically they are trying to explain some of the definitions and classifications used in civil aviation. Let's look at this document because this will be helpful for us to understand the meaning of that particular term that we just saw, right? Non-scheduled flight. Now this has an interesting chart here which I want to show you, though this is not directly related, but let's just see. That is the proposed classification of civil aviation activities. It will help us understand what kind of civil aviation activities are there. So they have divided civil aviation activities into commercial air transport services, then general aviation, then non-commercial, instructional flying, other flying, pleasure flying, aerial work. And then there are also further classifications: airport services, air navigation services, civil aviation manufacturing, aviation training, maintenance, regulatory functions, others. So all the civil aviation activities are classified into these broad heads. Now these broad heads have further subheads. So let's look at commercial air transport services. In this there are further subheads which says scheduled and non-scheduled. Now within commercial air transport there is scheduled and non-scheduled, and within non-scheduled then there are charter, on demand and other non-scheduled, right? Within on demand there is air taxi, commercial, business aviation and other. So you can look at this chart, you can pause the video and look at this chart, right? This is proposed classification, though still it will help us to understand the various civil aviation activities, right? Now what term that do we have to know? Right of non-scheduled flight. Now non-scheduled may include charter, on-demand, air taxi. Now what is the meaning of scheduled and non-scheduled? So here are some of the definitions where we can find what is the meaning of all these things. So scheduled. A scheduled international air service is a series of flights that possesses all the following characteristics. What are the characteristics? It passes through the airspace over territory of more than one state. It is performed by aircraft for the transport of passengers, mail or cargo for remuneration in such a manner that each flight is open to use by members of the public. It is operated so as to serve traffic between same or two or more points, either according to a published timetable, with flights so regular or frequent that they constitute a recognizably systematic series. So if air service is a series of flights that possesses all the following characteristic, then it becomes a scheduled international air services. Now, a non-scheduled air service is a commercial air transport service performed as other than a scheduled service. So whatever is other than a scheduled air service is a non-scheduled service. So what are the requirements again? It says it passes through airspace over the territory of more than one state. Okay, so international flight. It is performed by an aircraft for transport of passenger, mail, cargo, for remuneration in such a manner that each flight is open to use by members of the public. So it should be having a public use, either carrying of passengers, mail or cargo. Okay. It is operated so as to serve traffic between same or two or more points, either according to a published timetable or with flights so regular or frequent that they constitute a reasonably systematic series. Okay, so this is talking about carrying on of activity according to a system. So if all these three are present, that will be a scheduled international air service, and all the services which are not scheduled, which are not coming under these, are non-scheduled. So I guess that will help us understand the meaning of non-scheduled flight. In this article 5, we are not talking about international flights which carry mail, cargo, passengers according to a systematic timetable, right? So non-scheduled flights. Now let's see what article 5 says. Each contracting state agrees that all aircraft of other contracting states, being aircraft not engaged in scheduled international air service, shall have the right, subject to the observance of the terms of this convention, to make flights into or transit non-stop across its territory, and to make stops for non-traffic purpose without necessity of obtaining prior permission, and subject to the right of the state flown over to require landing. So what this means is, all the contracting states of this agreement, they agree that if it is an aircraft which is a non-scheduled air service, it can make flights into or in transit non-stop across the territory of the states which are parties for non-traffic purpose without the necessity of obtaining prior permission, and subject to the right of state flown over to require landing. That means you can fly non-scheduled flights over contracting parties without needing a prior permission to do so, without obtaining a prior permission. Now article 6 talks about scheduled air services, and we just saw what scheduled air services mean. No scheduled air service may be operated over or on the territory of a contracting state except with the special permission or authorization of that state in accordance with the terms of such permission or authorization. So scheduled air services need authorization. So scheduled air services cannot be operated over the territory of another state without authorization. But non-scheduled air services can be operated without prior authorization. So that's what we understand by reading the text of the convention, right? We are just now interpreting the text. We are not going to the state practice. We are just interpreting the text. So according to section 5 or article 5, there is a right of non-scheduled flights to flow without requiring prior permission, and according to article 6, scheduled air services need prior permission. We'll have to end it here. We'll continue the discussion in the next class, but before leaving, I did ask you some questions in the beginning, and the questions were: first, what is the difference between airspace and outer space? And I didn't give you the full answer, but I still gave you the answer, that the difference between airspace and outer space is, please think it and be prepared to write an assignment answer on this, because I have given answer in the video. The second question that I asked was, where does airspace end and where does outer space begin? I've also spoken about this in this video itself, so prepare an answer for that and be ready to answer it in the assignments. And then third is, why is there no agreement in the international community about demarcation between airspace and outer space? This question I didn't answer. I just said that at this point you can just assume that the height at which aircrafts fly, a little bit above that height is where the airspace ends. And there is no agreement because we don't know what will technology give us in future. Probably we'll need to extend the range of airspace. So states are a bit hesitant in putting a line to where airspace ends, because of course it's a matter of sovereignty and no state wants to be at the losing end. So there has been no agreement. I hope you understood the concepts I've taught in this class. I've taught quite a few, and a list of all the concepts that I've taught in this class is here for you to see. If any of them you don't understand, please go back and watch the video, rewatch it, and finish the assignment on time. Thank you.